in fact, not only is that how you have to deal with setbacks or unexpected things that come your way, I think it actually creates the opportunity, the serendipity. I was talking to somebody a couple of years ago, and he said to me that he has come to view the frequency of serendipity as the measure of a life well lived. Meaning, the more open you are to it, the more often when serendipity happens, you see it, you take advantage of it, you run with it. And then like that's the richness of life, is when you pursue those things.
Welcome to this week's episode of People Are the Answer. I truly believe that people are the only answer to the world's many problems. I'm Jeffrey M. Zucker, a serial entrepreneur, here to learn how innovators are creating outsized, transformational social impact and to shine a light on all the good happening in a world often hyper-focused on the negative. Today's episode features my friend Brian Abrams, a kind and brilliant human-first venture capitalist. Brian has spent nearly 2 decades in venture capital, having recently started B Ventures Group, a global VC firm focused on humanity, especially around AI solutions for peacebuilding and conflict resolution. Brian and I discuss his career path, the evolution of his worldview, and approaching all things with curiosity and considering what is possible. He shares poignant quotes and references that serve to frame his thought processes, which really allowed me to connect deeply with his perspectives. I'm really excited for you to listen to Brian Abrams on People Are the Answer. Brian, thanks so much for joining me on People Are the Answer.
Hey, thanks, Jeff. Always great to chat. Happy to do it on your show. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Glad to have you. And I know, we've known each other for at least a couple years now. And we brought up you joining the podcast at some point, and you recently told me that you were finally ready, which I was excited about.
Yeah, well, I had a lot of stuff cooking, and I wanted to wait for it to really come together. And that's happened in the last few months. So I think there's always lots to talk about, but now I think we've got even something better, something I'm really excited to share. So
awesome. I'm looking forward to digging in. And, I like to lately try to start off with a little bit of a tougher question. In life in general, what would you say motivates you?
Lots of things. I think, let me start with, there's a French Vietnamese monk who passed away a couple of years ago named Thich Nhat Hanh, probably one of the most amazing people in the entire world over the last century. And he had this philosophy of interbeing. And the idea is that we think we're each individuals. We think we're each discrete. You're Jeff, I'm Brian, whoever's listening is them, and that we're all separate. But in fact, we're actually part of a whole. We are interconnected in ways we're aware of and ways we're not aware of. And when you begin to think of all of humanity as one big whole, it changes everything about how you move through the world. Suddenly, being other-centered is actually in your own self-interest. And so I think what the biggest thing is I've grown and matured and aged a bit that motivates me is that sense of being part of a whole and trying to dedicate what I do toward serving that whole, which is humanity.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely love that answer, and it very much resonates with me. And I do a lot of work in drug policy, and that's led me into a lot of work with psychedelics. And a lot of what come from people's psychedelic experiences is sort of this oneness that we all kind of have, and certainly something that I've felt before. And to hear how that motivates you is awesome. And I've talked many times on the show about how I wish everyone on Earth could just kind of understand that we're all members of the same team, trying to make it and survive on planet Earth. So
100%. I haven't had that personal psychedelic experience myself, but I've heard from a lot of people, it's almost like a glimpse of the mountaintop. Like they get to quickly see that and sense that and feel that oneness. And then, the daily work is trying to do that every day. But anyway, yes, I love that. That's awesome.
And what are you focused on right now? We don't have to dig too deep yet, but at least tell us what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what I'm doing is launching one of the world's first venture capital funds focused on peace building and conflict resolution, with the idea that war and peace remains one of the biggest problems on this entire planet. As we know, you look at the news, read the newspapers, look around, it remains truly one of the biggest problems in humanity. And yet, almost all the solutions to date have been top down. It's United Nations, it's non governmental organizations, it's nonprofits, which is great. And there's a lot of great humanitarian work that gets done there. But a lot of times it's like rain that doesn't reach the ground. They're really nice ideas in Geneva or The Hague. But then when it comes time to being put into practice in a conflict zone, they're not getting there. Meanwhile, venture capital has this totally different approach. Instead of top down, it's bottom up. Instead of presuming to come up with the answer, it's simply asking the question and then experimenting and then discovering what works and what doesn't. And the things that work, you chase after with more resources and see if you can do it bigger, better, at scale. The things that don't work, you either shut it down or you pivot it to something new. So that business model that works really, really well in Silicon Valley and everywhere else where it's practiced hasn't really been brought to bear to the world of war and peace and conflict resolution. And yet the potential is huge. There's this, I use a lot of quotes, by the way. It's kind of how I organize my thoughts. But there's a great quote from Archimedes where he said, "Give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to put it, and I'll move the world." And I think to myself, we've got new technologies today that we've never had before in human history, like artificial intelligence. What if that's the lever? And what if venture capital is the fulcrum? And what if today we can put those things together and move the world in a little bit of a way, maybe in a big way, but in a way that's never been done before? So that's the short on what I'm up to. I could go on and on.
Yeah, well, I beyond what you just said, I love the way you think generally. It always excites me to hear the way that you see the world. And, I like to learn kind of how you got there to an extent. And I know, like me, you're based in Denver. Did you grow up here or where did you grow up?
Grew up here. Grew up here. Loved growing up in Denver. It's a wonderful place to be. I've lived and worked in many other places: Boston, New York, L.A. Traveled all over the world, but I've always come back here. Nice place to be.
Yeah, no, we love it here as well. So I can certainly relate to that. And um, what was it like for you growing up here? What was your life like? What was Denver like?
Pretty idyllic. I've got to say, I think there every morning. So I draw from every religious tradition I can draw from, but I'm Jewish by background. There's a Jewish prayer that observant Jews say every morning. The first thing they do when they open their eyes, they say "Moda ani," which is like basically thanks. It's in reverse. Um, I feel so grateful, in all the places in the world that you could be born, that you could grow up in, to be born in a place that is safe, to have all the basics in life, and to be able to then grow and explore and pursue interests, and again get to a place where you're doing that for the sake of other people. So you just asked about Denver, but I guess gratitude is the answer on that one.
No, I can appreciate that absolutely. And was giving back, to society, to the world, something that you thought about at all growing up? Is that something that came on more recently?
I wish it was something I was always always focused on. It took some time and maturity. I think, in life, you go through these different phases. And I think early on, naturally, we're very focused on ourselves and the things we want. And there's a great, if you've ever read Arthur Brooks' books, From Strength to Strength, he alludes to the four quarters of life. It's in the Hindu tradition. And the first phase is sort of the student phase, and you're just learning and finding your way, and then you move into the what he calls the householder phase, which is sort of a growth through accumulation. We're trying to advance in career, acquire whatever it is, accolades, power, money, whatever it might be. We tend to, again, this is very Western world, but then there's a mid stage kind of halftime. And if we're lucky, we transition from growing through accumulation to a phase of addition by subtraction, where instead of pursuing all those things that we think make us happy but don't actually, we start pursuing meaning. And most of the time, meaning comes from service and all those other things. So I'd love to tell you I was always focused on service. It's probably more of a last, 4 or 5 years sort of thing, or maybe the last couple of years. But I'm happy to have gotten there.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful to hear, sort of that evolution, and how that came about. And um, I'm excited to go through your career and talk about how you might have gotten there exactly. So, I saw you went to Harvard, and so tell me about that experience and kind of your first moves after school.
Yeah, there's an old Yiddish phrase, "We plan, God laughs." I mean, I think that's very much my path. I had lots of ideas of what I was going to be. I was very interested in math and physics, and I got to Harvard and discovered very, very quickly that I was nowhere near smart enough to be a physicist. So, okay, the other, I guess, the Mike Tyson corollary to the Yiddish saying is everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. So for for me, being a physics major was the punch in the face of like, oh, this isn't going to work. But I pivoted and I shifted over to international relations, and in the category of thank God for unanswered prayers, that ended up opening up all sorts of possibilities. This kind of these global travels that I later had to do work in India, to do work in Israel, now doing work all over the world. And so, again, kind of had a plan in mind. That plan didn't happen as I thought it would, which is how life almost always works out. But what did happen ended up being great.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like you took that with the right mindset. You didn't let yourself get down, when you found out that it wasn't going to be the right path, you just pivoted.
I think you have to. I think you have to. In fact, is it not only is that how you have to deal with setbacks or unexpected things that come your way, I think it actually creates the opportunity, the uh, serendipity. I was talking to somebody a couple of years ago, and he said to me that he has come to view the frequency of serendipity as the measure of a life well lived. Meaning, the more open you are to it, the more often when serendipity happens, you see it, you take advantage of it, you run with it, and then like that's the richness of life is when you pursue those things. So I want to be a physics major. That wasn't going to happen. You could look at that as a setback, or you can look at international relations as a serendipitous opportunity to go explore the world and then connect with people all over the place and become part of that oneness that is humanity. And how wonderful! What a terrific opportunity that was in hindsight.
Well, you very clearly, read a lot and have a lot of influences, have taken in the world to a great extent to determine your own worldview. And I'm curious, is that something that has been around for a while? Is that something that was more recent?
Yeah, I try to move through life with curiosity and openness. I think curiosity is the antidote to anxiety, and openness is the antidote to frustration. So if you just go through life curious and you say, what's going to happen next? What might come my way? What is this thing that's in front of me? How do I explore it further? And then when something doesn't play out the way you want it to, instead of saying like, oh, that's terrible, I really wanted X to happen and it was Y, instead say, sort of turn an exclamation mark into a question mark. Like, all right, well, where's this going to go? Where might this lead? What good stuff might come of this? And so I think the pieces that have always been there, but I've tried to kind of cultivate and grow that, and I continue to. I mean, you got to be humble. There's a whole lot I'm reminded of every single day that I don't know, and you got to keep staying curious, keep staying open.
Yeah, it's a healthy perspective to have to sort of take things with that openness and to sort of see what's coming instead of being upset when something doesn't go the way that you want. It seems to be a slowly recurring theme here, and I think that is really important in how you approach every day. And so, with that in mind, when you finished school, what path were you looking at?
There were a few years of kind of junior level finance that there's absolutely no need to go into. But then there was a spark a few years out of college, which was to start a company in India. At the time, all sorts of computer programming and development and engineering was starting to be done in India. This is like 2003. And I had the idea of, well, maybe I can do some knowledge work, some what we called corporate intelligence, which makes it sound nefarious. It wasn't. It was like Googling. but I thought, oh, we could do that there. I could hire here. I could hire there. I could grow this company, and it was a good idea because two other founders who had the same idea at the same time turned it into businesses worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I did not turn it into a business worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I, grew it from nothing to something. A handful of employees, and I'm proud of that 0 to 1. But what I learned was I was really good at seeing it, and I was not as good at doing it, at operationalizing it. And so after a few years, I owned that, and I shifted from being a founder to being an investor.
Yeah, that's another interesting perspective. I feel similarly in some manners that I am better at seeing it than executing it. I generally try to do both, but sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't in my various endeavors. But it's you seem to have long had a fair amount of self awareness.
Try. My father likes to say there are two kinds of people in this world: people who are humble and people who are about to be humbled. And so I'd rather be the first category than the second one. So try to stay self aware.
Yeah, and you mentioned your dad. Tell me a little bit about your parents.
Oh, they're great. I happen to be born into a wonderful family. Very loving, harmonious. Had all the basics, and very encouraging, very open. So I could go on, but just call it a very happy family.
Love that. And so you mentioned that first startup that was G2 Analytics.
That's right. That's right. Yep. And I did one more in India. It took, I learned, but sometimes it takes me a little while. So one other thing in India, and then shifted both from being a founder to being a venture capitalist, and shifted countries from India to Israel. And this was about 2011. The book, The Startup Nation, had come out a couple of years earlier, and that was the whole notion that Israel had the highest concentration of startups anywhere outside of Silicon Valley, most Nobel Prize winners per capita. Warren Buffett called it the Saudi Arabia of brains, which I always loved. And I just happened to, an old friend had said, I just took this trip to Israel. You should check it out. I'd never been there. Again, I'm Jewish, but I seem to have missed all the free trips to Israel that people get. But I read the book and I said, oh, this is amazing. This is really interesting. And I went, met a bunch of people. Again, knew nobody. I mean, when I went to India for the India startup, I knew nobody in the entire country, but I got intros and I built intros and built out a web of contacts. So Israel, same thing. And this time it finally worked, because I think we were in the right place at the right time. I don't give us credit for much, but I give us credit for that. And for going for it. We started, in a way, it was a bit of a startup. We started with a couple $1,000,000, which in some ways is a lot of money, but in some ways is very, very little in the world of venture capital, where people can, start with hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. But we're willing to try. And we got a little bit of luck early on. And so 2 million went to 10 million after a year. And then 10 million went to 20 million a year after that. 20 went to 40. And it started doubling every 12 to 18 months. So 80, 160, 320, 640. And it got to over $1 billion after about 10 years. So that ended up being an amazing place to be, and an amazing chapter.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, I mean, to go to Israel at that time, I mean, it seems like it was a great time, in Israel startup culture. Seems like you found a lot of gems there. And also, myself having worked a little bit in Israel, my dad having been born there, Israelis aren't always the easiest people to work with. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean that, they're tough and they're straight to the point, which is great. But it takes a certain hand to handle that properly and to make the most of these opportunities, especially coming in as an American.
Yeah, it was great. Again, openness, curiosity. When I was in India, I had to learn all about nonverbal communication. In India, we used to say yes means maybe, maybe means no, and you'll never hear the word no. In Israel, there is no maybe. It's only yes or no. And the only cultural etiquette breach you can have is to not say what you think. You've got to be totally direct. So it was a big shift to adjust to that culture. But again, it was great. And I've learned to love that directness, that when people say what they think and they say it directly, they also give you permission to say what you think and to be direct. And then amazing stuff comes out of it. In terms of Israel as an ecosystem for startups, that culture of directness, I think, is a huge part of why their startups have been successful. You look at startups in the US or elsewhere, there'll be a lot of euphemisms. So, somebody says, well, we had this initiative, but it didn't quite work. So, we're pivoting, or we're dealing with some challenges, all these euphemisms. In Israel, a CEO will say, last quarter, I told you about this new initiative. It failed. We canceled it. We're doing this new initiative now, and we're hopeful that will finally work. And what ends up happening is an iteration that might have taken a year or 2 years, if in the US or elsewhere, where it's sort of, uh, deal with all these euphemisms and totally. In Israel, by owning it, they speed up that timeline of iteration tremendously, and you end up taking something that they might have spent a year on and only spending 3 months on, and they evolve faster, and that is what ultimately makes a great startup.
Yeah. I mean, failing fast is one of the most important things of entrepreneurship, and it's cool to see how that sort of directness translates to that.
Yeah, I'm not even sure it's failing. I know this word has become very popular,
Sure.
but I think it's a process of experimentation. When you look
Yes.
at scientists experimenting, when they have an experiment that doesn't work, it's not a failure. It was the first experiment. Then they go run the second one as informed
With
by the
those
first one.
learnings.
Yes. And I think entrepreneurship, startups, it's all about experimenting over and over and over again. And the founders who look at it, who go into those experiments with not just an openness to feedback, but a real curiosity of feedback of, oh, you liked it. Well, why did you like it? You didn't like it. Why not? Tell me more. I'm actually seeking that feedback. They're the ones who then end up adapting the product, the solution, whatever it is, faster, figuring out what it is the market actually wants to pull as opposed to what it was they're trying to push. And that gets them to where they want to go.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been, a slow learning for me in my entrepreneurial journey. I'd say, having started my real estate business when I was in college, and just slowly, as some things work and some things don't, you start to learn how to take it. I mean, for some people, I'm sure it's faster, but for me, you start to learn how to take in the feedback properly, how to determine what the market wants. And, now I tell entrepreneurs, like, the one thing I can tell you is it's not going to go the way you think. So you need to be as open to evolution and adaptation as you possibly can. You got to
Absolutely.
give people what they want, not what you think they should want.
100%. We should reverse this. I
Yeah.
should now ask you some questions.
I mean, you're welcome to if you have any immediately, but
Well, let me ask you this: what was there a moment when that was sort of a revelation for you, or was that something that kind of built up over time?
yeah, I think it was just something that built up over time, over, like you said, experiments. I've done many entrepreneurial experiments in a variety of industries. And just throughout that time, I think it's just kind of been a slow learning process of, sometimes it might be like, oh, the vision I had for this thing makes total sense, but I didn't realize because of X factor, it's going to take 30 years to get there, even though it's right. Or, so things like a lot of things like that I've run into. And I'd say just the number one aspect is just market response. No matter how good you think something is, you have to look at how the market responds and react quickly and dynamically and efficiently. And so I think from a few of my endeavors, that was something I learned as well, is like, I'd rather, rapid prototype, get something out there and get immediate feedback rather than spending months and months and months on something to release it to a dud, if that makes sense.
Yeah, 100%. I don't know if you found this also, but it works outside of business, outside of startups, outside of ventures in life. You asked earlier about, like, have I always had the certain worldview? And it's definitely been an evolution. One of those things is receiving feedback. When I was younger, if somebody were critical about whatever I was working on, I took it very personally. It felt like a criticism of me as a person, not feedback on whatever it was I had done. And I think the older I've gotten, the more of it I'm able to embrace feedback as an opportunity to learn, or approach it with, again, a sense of curiosity of, that's interesting. Why didn't that land with you? What was it about what I did, or the product we had, or what I just said that didn't land? And I often, if I've got the presence to do it at the end of a meeting, will say something I learned from an executive coach. What about this worked, and what about this could have been better? What did you like, and what was the gap? What was the delta? And that leads to just constant learning. So I think, again, the recipe works really, really well for startups, but it also works pretty well in life.
Yeah. Agreed. And you mentioned briefly an executive coach. I'm curious, just popped in my head. Is that something that you've considered doing?
Being a coach?
Yeah,
Oh, I'm so flattered by, by
I could
that.
I could see it.
That's so nice. I think I probably have to learn a lot more before I'm really qualified to do that. But maybe someday. I'm flattered. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, you talked about your journey investing in Israel and the startups there, and that was, you said, about a 10-year journey. And then what led you to pivot and to perhaps move? I guess you moved on from that in some capacities.
Yeah, and by the way, to add one more thing to the previous question about coaching, because actually, at its best, a venture capital investor is something of a coach or a confidant for the founders they invest in. I think there's this um, when done badly, venture capitals view themselves as a boss, somebody who sits up here with the founders sitting below them. At their best, they rotate that 90 degrees, and now the founder and the venture capitalist sit side by side as partners.
Those are the
And
best
suddenly,
relationships. It's mutually
yes,
beneficial.
absolutely. So even though, to your question of have I ever been a coach, not officially, but I think at best a coach for founders and sort of a side by side peer coach in a way, which is I think the best coaching. Again, we're all human beings.
Yep.
We're all equal in the vast majority of senses. And when we go into a relationship that way, the best way to teach is to learn, and the best way to coach is to also be coached and be receptive to that feedback. So I wanted to share that. I was thinking about it afterward. Now I've completely forgotten your previous question.
No worries. No, I mean, if people take anything from this conversation, I hope they take that with them, that uh, what you when you have to both give and take from everyone. You don't have to worry so much about hierarchy. I feel like in business and social settings, in so many aspects of our current society, there is so much of that hierarchical, you know, mess. And it leads people going into meetings and rooms not being straight or transparent because they're feeling pressures from that. And so I definitely think the best relationships, the most successful business relationships, come from that place of, no one being on a pedestal.
Totally. Ralph Waldo Emerson said something like, every person is my teacher, and it's incumbent on me to figure out what they have to teach me. And I love that. If you go through life, every person I meet, every human being is a universe unto themselves. What can I learn from them in that interaction? Magic. I mean, it unlocks so much good stuff. Because truly, every person I meet is an amazing, interesting person, and when you dive into it, there's so much there. Sometimes it's a little too much. Occasionally, I'll be at a cocktail party, and my wife will be like, "Easy there with discussing that person's childhood. Can we talk about sports, for 2 minutes here?" So sometimes it's too much, but generally speaking, I think it's a wonderful way to move through life.
Yeah, agreed. And yeah, I was just talking about prior, asking you about finishing up your time, focused on Israeli startups and, staying involved to some capacity in the company. But, what led you to sort of make that change?
Yes. So I feel like I'm using so many quotes. We're going to have like some show notes on this, but it's how I anchor my thoughts. There's a quote from Immanuel Kant. This is like 300 years ago. And he said something to the effect of, a human being should never be treated as a means to an end, only an end in and of themselves. Don't use people. People are a sacred thing, a sacred entity, and they should be treated that way. And I think of, even your the title of your podcast, "People Are the Answer," right? People are, that's it. But if you look at venture capital, most of it treats people as a means to an end. It says, let's invest in these startups and use that to make money. It's a human means to a financial end, when it should be the other way around. And for me, the revelation was, it should be not a human means to a financial end, but a financial means to a human end.
Hmm.
It should be
Absolutely.
in service of people, right? That's even just look at the flow within venture capital. We have venture capital funds have limited partners, who are our investors. They invest into venture capital funds, which invest into portfolio companies, which hire employees, or they even sometimes call them full-time equivalents, FTEs, which is the worst, the most dehumanizing term. But actually, those abstractions, dehumanize. But every single step along the way, they're human beings. The limited partners, they're human beings. They have hopes and dreams and fears and anxieties and all those things. The founders, same thing. The people who work at startups, same thing. So if instead we look at it as human beings connecting with other human beings, connecting with other human beings, connecting with other human beings, all for some sort of common purpose, then suddenly so much more is possible. We're not trying to use people to make money. We're trying to use money to serve people. And so that was kind of a revelation that occurred to me. Not that my prior firm that I effectively co-founded wasn't helping people in a lot of ways, but to me, that should have been or should be at its best, the starting point. And so I transitioned to this new firm, B Ventures, in order to pursue it with that as a first principle.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think, like you said, there can be things that are doing good that you're investing in, but to have it as the first principle is really impactful and important. And for me, a big aspect of all of this is, we can both create positive impact and create sustainable, efficient businesses that provide. And I think, I talk frequently on the podcast about people distinguishing too much or caring too much about nonprofit versus for-profit. It's really like, are we creating sustainable impact? Is it feeding families, et cetera? So I really appreciate that being a first principle. And so it sounds like, that sort of realization is what led you in this direction. So tell me about B Ventures Group. I know it's been a process to determine exactly what that was going to look like.
Yeah, it's been a lot of what we've been talking about, a lot of serendipity, a lot of openness, curiosity, and serendipity. It started with the hypothesis, or not the hypothesis, the realization that the whole world is full of amazing people. Every single country, every single culture, every single place in the world where there are human beings, there's great stuff. So I started exploring Southeast Asia, in particular Vietnam, which I think if you're just going to bet on one single country economically over the next 10 years, Vietnam is it. I mean, they are the number one beneficiary of the whole reglobalization between US and China and all that stuff. And the whole venture capital and startup industry or ecosystem is maybe 5 years old. So it's like, and we've seen this before. Like in Asia, we saw it from Japan to Korea to Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, China itself, India. Like Vietnam's next. To me, that is very clear. I think if anybody out there, some sort of budding international venture capitalist, wants to just do really well and generate a terrific fund, like just go to Vietnam. Let's stop there. But then, so I traveled over Southeast Asia and I was really interested in that. And then I was in Europe and I was especially meeting Ukrainian founders who I knew were very talented because a lot of the Israeli companies I used to work with would hire a lot of people in Ukraine. Most people, understandably, had looked at the headlines, looked at the war, and just sort of written off Ukraine. And capital, investment in Ukraine had dropped like 80% after the war. But the vast majority of founders and their teams were still cranking away. So you had supply of capital drop 80%, but supply of opportunity dropped only maybe 20%. So I thought, oh, this is, yes to Vietnam and Southeast Asia, but also yes to Eastern Europe and Ukraine especially. And then I went to Northern Europe. There are great founders there. So all of that, I felt very, very interested in the global opportunity. We have a bias, I think, in the U.S. of just investing in our backyard, especially if you live in the Bay Area. And yet there's this amazing supply of people everywhere. So then I was just on a lark. I was reading about AI, right? This AI was I think, became on everyone's radar about a year ago. And I was reading about this story where, if you remember, a little bit of a tangent here, but if you remember, many years ago, IBM created a computer program to take on the world's best chess player, Gary Kasparov, and it won, which was like an amazing turning point for early AI. So Google, not to be outdone, was like, hold on, if IBM's winning in chess, we got to do that, but we can't beat chess. They've already done it, so we'll do the game of Go, the Asian kind of equivalent of chess. So they developed this system called AlphaGo and trained it, got it good enough to take on the world's best players. So this was this big match. First, like 36 moves of this Go match were kind of ho-hum, like professional level, but uninspired. And then suddenly, so the grandmaster plays this move 36, and there are really only two moves you would play at that point. You put a stone above it, or you put a stone to the side of it. But AlphaGo, the computer program, does neither of those things. It places a stone completely on the other side of the board, unrelated to anything. So much that like the AlphaGo technicians thought it made a mistake. The grandmaster thinks they made a mistake. He's like he's confused. Then he thinks it's kind of funny. Then he's almost offended. Then he gets up, leaves the room, goes and like has a smoke and tries to figure out how he's going to handle this thing. Comes back. They end up playing the rest of the match. And of course, AlphaGo wins because even though this move is one that the vast majority of human beings would never play because it made no sense. 1 in 10,000 games, it's the right move. And the AI knew that. And it was unburdened by human biases. Right. And it kind of showed a new possibility. So I was reading that and an idea occurred to me. What if you had that for real life? For take negotiation, for example. What if you had an AI co-pilot for negotiation where everybody's starting at point A, everybody would agree at point B, but without AI, it's going to fall apart because we're human and somebody will overreach and somebody will overreact and somebody will walk away. But what if you had an AI co-pilot to help get more of those deals to yes, to close? That could be both worth a lot of money. If you help Microsoft or Google close 10, 20, 30% more M&A deals, for example, acquisitions, that's worth billions of dollars. And then the question I posed in the article that I posted on LinkedIn, if you could do it for companies, could you also potentially do it for countries? And if you do it for countries, what might be possible? And that, I thought, 5 people would read this article, like my wife, my parents, my sister, and like one random person on the internet. But I got this outpouring of interest from all over the world. People who said, not only is that possible, I've been looking for you. There should be a whole ecosystem of people using this kind of approach toward this problem with this both and kind of idea, and nobody's doing it. One guy said, I've been waiting my whole life for you. So that to me was like the spark. And I was like, okay, this is the market pulling it. The market saying we have this huge problem, war and peace. We have this solution that hasn't been used, venture capital and startups. Please try that. And that was the spark that said, okay, my next fund has to be global. Yes, Southeast Asia. Yes, Eastern Europe. And yes, AI and startups for the cause of peace building and conflict resolution.
Yeah. I love how that all came together and that it just was sparked sort of from this idea that you had and you decided to put that out there and share that. And then you had this incoming. And I remember when you first told me about this, I was certainly just, my eyes were wide because, wow, that's a really cool way to think about it. I, hadn't really thought about that. And to think of just the way that you explain with the game of Go, just there's something completely out there that humans might not consider that now we'll have a partner to potentially consider it. And, this also brings to mind sort of some of the controversy around AI. There's so many people that are scared and doomsayers. And then there's other people that are more of the abundance principles that think that, it's taking us in a great direction. And I think that, the answer might be somewhere in between fully, but this shows, an abundance mindset around AI, the types of things that it could do and the types of healing that it could bring to humanity, with working with humans, not something it's going to do on its own or take over or anything like that.
Yes. Like AI is a creation of human beings. So naturally it's going to reflect all of human tendencies, good, bad, optimist, pessimist, productive, counterproductive. But I think of the arc of human civilization almost like the stock market in a way, like it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it crashes down, it goes up even higher again. And over the long run, I mean, any given day, it could go up, it could go down. You have no reason, you have no idea whether or why. But if you look at the stock market over 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years especially, it goes up. And I think of human progress most broadly in the same way. Over any given year, decade, it looks like you'd be heading the wrong way. But if you look over the arc of centuries or millennia, certainly it's going up. AI, same thing. They're going to be any given day, week, month, year, there are going to be examples of AI for good, AI for bad. But if it mirrors humanity over the long run, I think it's going to be good. And I think if we focused a little bit less on the danger, which is natural, we feel anxiety and we express that in the way we think about AI, we project it onto something like AI. If instead we apply the concept of possibility, what might be possible with AI? How could it be used for good? We lean into that a little bit. Who knows? I mean, again, maybe AI. Not maybe. I'm betting. Literally, financially, reputationally, and otherwise, that not only can it, it will. I think AI can be very, very successful as a for-profit investment, and maybe not everywhere all at once, but maybe in one conflict zone, one time, bring a war to an end a little bit sooner than it might have otherwise. Or in another conflict zone, keep it in the nonviolent conflict phase, whereas it might have erupted into conflict otherwise. And in that way, save people's lives. I'll give one, if it's all right with you, one little story of like the potential here. So there's this brilliant guy named William Ury, and he's like the godfather of negotiation. He wrote the book Getting to Yes like 30 years ago, and he's since become this international master mediator in places like Colombia, Venezuela, North Korea, Indonesia, all over. And one of the examples he uses, including I think in his new book Possible, which just came out a couple of months ago, he uses the example of fire. So for most of human history, fire was one of the greatest, most existential risks to living in a city. That if Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicks over a lantern in a barn in Chicago, as it did in 1871, the whole city can burn down, as happened in Chicago. More recently, really the last 100 years, we've developed tools, techniques, and technologies that can preempt fire, can mitigate it when it breaks out, and can put it out quickly. So that now, at least in the developed world, fire is no longer an existential threat to cities. It still happens. Houses still catch on fire, buildings still catch on fire, but it's put out quickly. The same is possible with war, I believe. Conflict is inevitable. Conflict is part of human nature. We're always going to have conflict. Arguably, we should have even more of it and, work it out faster. But violence is not. And my great hope, the potential, and again, AI could be a big part of this, is that we can get to a point where we prevent, preempt, mitigate, and resolve episodes of conflict and even small little bursts of violent conflict quickly enough that they don't erupt into war the way fire used to erupt into, a city engulfing inferno. So that's what's possible. And AI, I think, could be a big part of it. It's the Archimedes quote. It could be the lever that moves the world.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that fire analogy should really ring for some people. I think that gives really good perspective around it, and what a place it could be if we could put out wars like we've put out city fires. If you're enjoying this episode, I would greatly appreciate if you could review, like, comment, or subscribe on your favorite platforms. Your engaged support goes a long way in helping the show grow and getting our impactful guests heard. Now back to the show. You mentioned earlier peace building and conflict resolution with these tools. So can you maybe give some examples of how this could work? And also, are there models that exist right now where I could just say, here's what's going on, what would you do?
Yes, and yes. I'll give you an example. They can come from the pure for-profit side and have a peace-building application they haven't thought of, or that maybe is peripheral but still meaningful. Or they can come from the nonprofit world and have a for-profit business model that they're not aware of or that may be peripheral. So I'll give you an example of each. On the for-profit side, there's a company I made a personal investment in last year that is AI for financial crime, fighting financial crime with AI. So to them, to their customers, it looks like it's just enterprise level AI for productivity. Instead of a bank manager having to spend a week investigating a potential incidence of financial crime, they can do it in an hour because the AI has like done everything they would have otherwise done and already written the report, and they can just scan it, make sure it's correct, edit the report, and they're done. Huge productivity saver. A bank can go from spending $25 million on something to spending a couple $1,000,000. It's a great business. That should be worth, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars. And it's also keeping money out of the hands of international bad guys like arms dealers or human traffickers or organized crime syndicates. That's making the world a little bit less violent and a little bit more peaceful. So that's an example of like, if I were just investing to generate returns, I would invest in that company, and it serves the mission. On the flip side, I met that one's, by the way, that company's out of Iceland. So you talk about the world full of talented human beings. Most investors aren't going to Iceland, but if they did, they'd discover amazing stuff. Okay, the other one is what started as a nonprofit idea out of Israel. It's AI to I describe it as a stoplight for negotiation. It says right now, let's say in Israel, between the Israelis and the Palestinians, it's a red light. They're not willing to talk. Every negotiation, breaks down, but their AI may soon give a green light. Their AI may soon, based on data and signals, not human opinions, but everything they're reading, either in the news or social media or otherwise, it may say, hey, you've got a window where there's a green light, or at least that red, yellow, international, like get ready for the green light moment. And you're going to have a window to negotiate and to potentially reach an agreement. And it won't last that long. So this AI becomes tremendously powerful in the world of conflict zones. And they have this amazing for-profit business model that they weren't even fully aware of. We started talking, and I said, if you can do that for countries, you can also do it for companies. So now let's say Google has had their eyes on a startup that they want to acquire, and they're watching it. If it can give them a green light, hey, Google, now go acquire this startup for $100 million before it's going to cost you $200 million or $500 million or $1 billion in 1, 2, 3 years. Go get it now. That's worth a lot of money to Google. So you've got this both profitable, successful, exciting, investable business models, and things that can also contribute to peace building and conflict resolution. So those are a couple examples from kind of opposite sides of the spectrum.
Yeah. It's amazing that those things exist. I love how people are thinking, and then, you giving them sort of a direction like, oh, you could also think of it this way. And now they're finding all these other things that what they've created can do. And, how do you source deals? How do you find the guys in Iceland and things like that?
A lot of it's serendipity. A lot of it is some of the stuff we talked about at the beginning, being curious, being open, putting yourself out there. A lot of people I find there can be a tendency to be afraid of posting something, of having a conversation. Most people feel imposter syndrome. I certainly had it. Early days, it wasn't even syndrome. I was like an actual imposter, and I graduated to imposter syndrome. And I think only recently have graduated to like certain things I'm actually capable of. But most people have that, and it requires embracing vulnerability to lean into that and put things out there. If it's an idea you've got or a connection you want to make, whatever medium you use to make those connections, put it out there. Have a conversation. Risk sounding foolish, sounding like you don't know what you're talking about. Because when you do that a lot, more often than not, what happens is you don't sound foolish. All the things you're afraid of happening don't happen. And instead, serendipity happens. These connections happen. Connections lead to more connections. And ultimately, you have a broad, vast network and things find you. So unlike, I think, traditional venture capitalists where there's a lot of effort of, spamming founders and trying to get their attention, all that, I don't do that at all. I've spent my whole life building up networks of human connection where I know people from one human being to another human being. We know each other, we get each other, we like each other. And they call me up and they say, hey, Brian, I know we haven't talked in 6 months, but I just came across, I remember you talking about that company in Iceland or that company in Israel, that company in Ukraine or Vietnam. And I stumbled on this other one, and you should check it out. Um, and I get a tremendous amount of inbound that way, and it's the best kind of inbound because it comes through people who I have a real relationship with. And I'll add one more thing, which is I think AI is already and will become ever more a part of making those connections happen, and so much the better.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely gets me excited for the future whenever we talk about what you're working on, because and that's part of what this podcast is supposed to do as well. There's so much negativity in our world and in our media coverage that people ignore some of the incredible things that are going on, and it's awesome how you're finding these amazing people all over the world that are doing really important, impactful work.
It's it's all worth doing. The Back to William Ury for a second. He talks a lot. Again, his last book is called Possible, and one of his principles is it may be improbable, but if it's possible, it's worth going after. One of my side projects, which I can only talk about a little bit publicly here, but completely unrelated to B Ventures. Since October 7th, I've been working with Israelis, Palestinians, people in the Gulf, people in Europe, people in the US to try to find creative solutions to the war in Gaza, whether it's ending the war or the aftermath of the war that, could go badly in many different ways, but also possibly could go well. Also, possibly could lead to a reconstruction and a rebuilding, and maybe open up the possibility of peace in this region where it might not have been possible before October 7th. As awful as October 7th was, and as awful as the subsequent months of war have been, it may create the possibility for peace that wasn't there before. And so, yes, the world is full of problems and risks and pitfalls and all of those negative things. And AI, as we're talking about, is also a reflection of that. But there's also in everything opportunity for positive outcomes, and not just small ones, potentially big ones. And half of this is just having our eyes open to those possibilities and being willing to risk pursuing them, even if the odds are long, even if the obstacles are numerous. Because if we do that enough, eventually we break through, and big positive things do happen.
Well, obviously, venture capital requires some patience and some time. You know, where is B Ventures now, and what is sort of your longer term vision?
Just launching, um, hoping to have our first close in summertime, and then actually be deploying capital. Right now, it's just been small personal investments I've been making. But the real hope is that this is an ecosystem that begs to exist. And if I look at climate tech as a precedent, if we go back 10 years, climate tech barely existed as an ecosystem. It was a couple $1 billion globally, which again sounds like a lot, but is pretty small. In 2022, it reached almost $70 billion. So from less than 2 to 70 in 10 years. If you think of the possibility of venture capital applied to peace building and conflict resolution, which today is almost non-existent. It's not even a billion. It's probably 100 million, maybe, globally, which is nothing. The possibility is if I can help contribute to the creation of an ecosystem, if I can show that peace can be profitable and profits can lead to peace, and you can create at its best, let's say a 10x fund that not only does all this, but does it really, really well. So if all you want to do is make money, great. It's a great way to make money. If you care about peace and conflict resolution and new approaches to an age-old problem, it does that. If you want both, so much the better. And my dream is that it works and that people copy it and they do it better
Yeah.
and they do it bigger. And in 10 years, we have an entire ecosystem full of dozens or hundreds of venture capital funds focused on peace building that also opens up the opportunity for hundreds or thousands of founders to go after novel solutions that exist only in their heads that they might not do if they couldn't find funding, and that becomes a virtuous circle. And that actually would be the lever that moves the world.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exciting. I hope that it's the start of this great ecosystem, and certainly precedent for it, in terms of talking about things like climate tech. Um, and I'm very hopeful to see where it goes. And I'm confident that if it's not already, that it will be saving lives, and that its potential peaks are, as high as you can imagine.
From your lips to God's ears.
Absolutely. And so you've been doing impact related work for a while, even when it wasn't your first principle. I think a lot of the things you invested in created positive impact. Has there been a specific time or incident in your life where you really saw how much your work could affect change?
Never more than the present. I see these people I'm connecting with. I'm heading to Europe very soon. Again, I can't get into all of it, but I'm sitting down with Israelis, Palestinians, people from states in the region, Americans, Europeans, and everyone's coming together to discuss what might be possible and all the different ways we might be able, as private sector, not government, um, come up with new ideas and help advance the cause of peace in that region. Um, it's amazing when you start having those conversations, you get in those rooms, and you start seeing that we presume everything's already happening. We presume all the things that we want to happen, somebody somewhere is already doing it, right? And what I've learned is no, if you don't do it, no one's going to do it. And so, and once you start to try to do it, it's amazing how quickly you find your way to the center of the action, and how much you can actually move the needle. So, maybe it's just the recency bias of what I'm working on, thinking about, but I've never been more heartened by what I'm seeing today, even amidst all the darkness and suffering and difficulties in the world. I've never been more heartened by the possibility that good things can emerge, and I'm seeing it already. Just stuff I'm working on presently.
Yeah. Well, that's promising for, everyone that's concerned out there. And I know there's a lot of good people doing a lot of tremendous work that doesn't always see the light of day initially, but will hopefully long term feel the effects of. And one thing that I've caught through our conversation is just continually is your perspective and how you're able to kind of zoom out from yourself a little bit and see the way things fit into the world, how potential dominoes can fall. In your career, have you had any mentors that have been particularly impactful that have maybe led you in that to think like that?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. But there's so many. We were talking earlier, about the Emerson quote of every person is my teacher. Yes, I mean, so many mentors in so many different ways, but not just successful, illustrious, famous people. Also, people I meet, anywhere, just throughout the day, naturally. So many things. I'm struggling to come up with specific instances right now, because there's so many, and it's like a daily. Everybody can be your mentor.
Yeah. I mean, I love that quote. Everybody can be your mentor. It is so important to learn from everyone. And we mentioned earlier, not feeling like anyone is beneath you or vice versa. We're all humans that are capable of similar things, that all have tremendous potential, regardless of our background. And the idea that you can learn from each and every one of us is such an important thing to keep with us. And, for myself and a lot of these perspectives, I always wrestle with, this is awesome. It resonates. How do I continue to keep that in my thoughts during my everyday life, as I'm going through my various endeavors and trying to get through an issue, etc. It's like, how do I hearken back to that?
I was going to ask you that question. How do you? What is the? If I could flip it around to you, who are some of the mentors who have influenced you, or what are some of the types of those conversations, and how do you weave that into your life for you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, in terms of mentors, certainly very many as well. I would say that it's taken me time to get better and better at not only like taking in feedback, like we talked about earlier, but just being willing to accept help. Um, and my dad, both my parents, but initially my dad was very much that when he was around, and he always was able to turn things into a positive perspective. And um, always approached everything in life with, Tikkun Olam, repair the world and everything that we do. And so it's something I've tried to always carry with me, and I always have in the back of my mind. And my mother has continued to build on that tradition, and so that's really where it comes from for me. And then um, I did Kait, my producer, interviewed me for a couple episodes, and one thing I realized is, when you go back and look sort of slowly at what you've been doing, you get a better perspective on it. And I think that's something I like that these interviews give to people, a moment to step back and see what they've done, instead of just sort of being in it all the time. And what that made me realize is just how many people I've kept knowledge and wisdom from, even if it was just one incident, or like maybe, a person that I spent a fair amount of time with, but I have this one thing that really sticks. And so I just found that, my head is full of a million of those, and they come into play when they do. And as my kids are getting older, I'm learning how to integrate that into parenting, like all of these different thoughts and lessons. And so I know I went on a little bit of a ramble since you asked, but I try to learn from everyone as well. In my head, you're just way better at it than I am, but I'm getting there.
That is kind, and no, I don't think I am. I'm learning myself. One of the things I do as we're talking, and I don't know if this is something that's found its way to your practice, but there was a meeting I had a few years ago, and somebody was running late, and they sent me one of those texts that was like, "Hey, so sorry I'm late. Traffic, parking, this, that." And I was like, "Don't worry, like relax. You're actually giving me a gift of time to catch my breath." And when I got that, I sort of put my phone down and I tried to take a minute to think about, who is this person? Where are they coming from? How are they feeling coming in this? What's weighing on them? What are they dealing with in their life? And then, how do I want this conversation to go? And then when they got there, I asked them about their life. And what I ended up getting was incredible. It was, not this person rushing in and me being frustrated that they were late. What ended up happening, we got into a deep conversation about some things that they were experiencing with a family member that was really difficult, and we ended up having this incredibly, you know, empathic connection all around, just on a human level. And it was made possible by asking the question that you were asking: how do I bring this to bear in my daily life? There's someone, Pedram Shojai, I believe is how his name is pronounced, who wrote a book called The Art of Stopping Time. And what he says is, if you can take 30 seconds every hour, just 30 seconds to pause and say, what am I doing right now? What's going on around me? That's it. 30 seconds. It opens up a universe. So anyway, I love your question, and I think what it is, it's an invitation for daily practice of just take these things we learn and try to put them into practice in our daily life in little ways.
Yeah, for sure. It's important to try to remember to take those pauses. I mean, especially when you're in the middle of something going on, right now for me, it's like launching this movie, The Late Game. Like it can be hard sometimes because there's so much to do. It can be hard to sit back and pause, but sometimes when you take that moment, that's what spurs, the breakthrough that is going to get you through the rest of it.
Are you able to do that? Like, I know The Late Game, as we record this, is premiering here in Denver, and it's been all around the country. Are you able, when you go to those, to ever sit back and just say, "Wow, we did this. Look at the tangible output of all this, like, blood, sweat, and tears, and effort, and investment, and everything else"?
Yeah, I mean, I always try to go back to that. Even when we finished shooting it, in September of 2022, just walking away, having put that footage together, 33 hours of footage or whatever. It's like, wow, like we at least we did that. Like we got through that. And now, come January when we finished the cut of the film, the final cut, it was just, regardless of what anybody thinks of it, regardless of how many people watch it, like we made this. We made a movie. So for anybody that is going to speak negatively about it, it's like, well, we did it and we're proud of that. So I do think about that sometimes, at a good time for reflection at some of these events is if I'm not running around, when I actually get to sit in the theater while people are watching it, you do get some time to reflect a little bit. And yeah, I'm proud of what we were able to accomplish with, especially given that we had limited resources and everything. It's very meaningful, but we're also doing a million things. So yeah, it's important to try to find that time.
I love that. There's a quote in the Bhagavad Gita, the one of the canon books of Hinduism, that says something like, "Act without attachment to the fruit of your action." Basically, do the thing for its own sake, and if you do that, it's a success no matter what. I think about, like, I know the film is awesome, and I cannot wait to see it myself. But it almost doesn't matter. You know, the process of creating it, I'm sure for you was so meaningful, and everybody else who was involved with it. It's already, the minute it's finished, it's magnificent. It's a tremendous accomplishment just because you did it for all the right reasons. And I suspect in this case, it's also an amazing film that I can't wait to watch, that people will love.
Yeah, thank you. And I think people that kind of get it genuinely love it and enjoy it. And I would say the when we first showed the final cut in a room of our cast and crew, that was, at the time, I called it the most rewarding day of my career, because it was all these people that put so much time and effort into this, and they got to see this finished product. And it didn't matter that it hadn't been out there yet. It just, we all got to see like what we'd done, and it just felt really good.
And I think there's some universality in that too. Like, if anybody's listening, they're thinking about the project they're working on, the project they just did, or the project they're about to finish. Um, when you detach from the outcome a little bit and just say, "Man, that was a really worthwhile thing. Like, I worked hard on that. I put my heart into it, and I'm really happy with that effort." Then there you go.
And I mentioned earlier, like, a lot of entrepreneurial experiments, and obviously some of those end in quote failure, but every time that they have, no matter what way they've fallen, I've always tried to take learnings from them and seen them as an educational experience, a better educational experience than you can get pretty much any other way than just doing something. And so,
Absolutely.
yeah, even from the things that do make money, from the things that don't, I mean, I often feel like you learn more from the failures than the successes.
100%, and they just make you better. I was having this conversation with my 9 year old because over the weekend he had a soccer game, and it was super cold, super windy. They got walloped. I mean, it really, like, everything that in his world would be a negative happened. And I was saying to him, "Hey, buddy, all of life is practice. This is practice. The next time you play a cold game, you're going to be that much better at it. The next time you lose in a blowout, you're going to recover that much faster." All of this is so good. And, he's 9 years old. So he didn't have that much to offer back, although he's a bright young kid. But I could see the wheels churning in his head. And I think, sometimes when you explain things to a kid, you actually explain them to yourself. And I found myself reflecting on it and just thinking, yes, all of life is a practice and an experiment and something to learn from. And the more you embrace it that way, the better you get.
Yeah.
And so, may this film be incredibly successful, as I'm sure it will be. And the next one will probably be even more so, and the next one even more so, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I hope so. And I really liked what you said about explaining something to a kid is kind of explaining it to yourself. Because that very much happens, even my son, who's almost 4, like, he'll ask me something and I'll come up with whatever I say. And I'm like, oh, interesting. I hadn't really thought of it that way until I had to explain it to him.
Totally.
Yeah. So
Totally.
that goes a long way. And I certainly think every parent should listen to, how things are coming through to their kids, and think about them from their perspective.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity. I remember listening to another podcast where a guy named John Kabat-Zinn, who wrote this book, "Everywhere You Go, There You Are," and others. And he's kind of this, one of the early evangelists of mindfulness. Evangelist is the wrong word. He would say not evangelist, but anyway, proponent, advocate. Thank you.
Sure.
And he, somebody was interviewing him. They said, "This is all nice, and you with your Zen on the mountaintop, but how about in real life? Like, if you're parenting and you got kids screaming about whatever, like, it's a little harder to be all Zen about it." Then he said yes, and he views his kids as these little Zen masters, these little, like, difficult, challenging, wonderful, but provocative little teachers. And in the same way, in the Zen tradition, the Zen master will often provoke their students or challenge them with something that's irrational and frustrating and whatever, just to teach them how to deal with that. I think we can even look at our kids, even when they're screaming, even when they're frustrated, even when they're tired or hungry or whatever, as our own little teachers, and and then learn from that. I'm not always able to practice that. Sometimes they drive me nuts too, but at my best, I'm able to
Yeah.
say, "All right, little 9-year-old Zen master, thank you."
Yeah, I mean, it's so true, and like you said, it's not always doable in the moment, but you certainly try. And it came up couple podcast episodes ago as well, the daily dad email that I get from Ryan Holiday, and that I think today's was something to the effect of all those things that you're annoyed by, like at some point it's going to be the last time they do it, and you're going to wish that they were still asking you whatever they were asking you. So it's just important to always have that perspective, even in the most difficult of times, because wanting something to pass is just wanting time to fly, and it's going to fly already.
I love that. I think that's great, and I love his book on the Daily Stoic and the obstacle is the way. The obstacle is the way. I mean, that's it right there. Whatever it is that's in front of you, that's not something to work around. That is the path, and it is the dealing with the obstacle that is the whole purpose of it. So I love that. I may have to subscribe to the Daily Dad. I don't have that.
It's awesome. You should. Honestly, I think any dad should. I mean, I always wonder, like, I haven't actually looked into if they have a mom version. I'm sure they do, but I think that most of the stuff he says applies regardless of what gender the parent is.
Yeah, that's great. Oh, I love that.
And, if aside from family, that's because that's usually the first answer to this question. If it were to all end tomorrow, whatever that means to you, what are you most grateful for or most proud of?
Yeah, it's part of my personal practice to imagine that I'll sometimes stand on a busy street corner and cars are coming at me, and I'll imagine, what if this is my last moment? And it does usually foreground the things that are important and background the things that aren't. So I mean, I'm grateful for everything. I'm grateful to have this life, to be able to live in a safe place, to have basic needs met, to have family and a wonderful wife and kids, and sort of live my life. And then I'm grateful for, if I can focus on, I'm grateful for every breath. Try to just appreciate whatever it is in the moment. And I'm humble too. I realize that if it were all over in the next moment, it was a very, very small piece of the puzzle. But try to do the best I can, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all small, important pieces of the puzzle. Even people that are the big names and things like that. It's everybody's a small piece of the puzzle, and we're all in many ways equal pieces. And um, I really appreciate how you're trying to kind of sow the seeds of peace in really thoughtful ways and technological ways. And um, in a less thoughtful and technological ways, I asked this question: if you could snap your fingers and fix one thing in the world, what would it be, and how do you think that change would reverberate?
I mean, for me, it's very much violent conflict, and that is I look at, again, if you go back to the Thich Nhat Hanh notion of interbeing, we're all one single human organism of which each individual is just simply a part, like yeah, just a node on a network or a finger on a hand. Um, I look at violence as almost like a form of collective self harm in a way, and so I would love it if we as a human species could stop harming ourselves. I think
Yeah.
conflict will always happen. Again, it's part of human nature. It's part of the human condition, but it doesn't have to be violent conflict, or at least we have the potential as a human, as humanity collectively, to evolve past the point where we resolve things violently. I think of there's something in Buddhism that says something like, pain is inevitable, suffering is optional.
Hmm.
I think of conflict as inevitable, but war is optional. We again, not in all cases. I recognize the reality of the world is very complicated, and sometimes, um, we have armies and things are required. But over the long arc of human history, thinking forward in decades or even centuries, I think the possibility is there that we evolve past a violent expression of conflict. So if I could wave my magic wand, that would all happen right now.
I love it. What a incredible world it would be if we could get past violence. I mean, it doesn't make sense just in itself, right? Like, why are we hurting each other because of this? Why are we hurting this random guy in the military because of something his country did? Like it, so I hope that we can get to a place. And like you said, I mean, there's just realities of our current environment and the fact that, we can't, just because we decide one thing doesn't mean we can get the other side to decide it, obviously. And, but I'm hopeful with technology, with just growth in humanity, that we are climbing that ladder slowly but surely.
Absolutely. Again, your lips to God's ears.
Yeah, let's make it happen. And I really appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us and your story. I've really enjoyed it. Excited to keep our conversation going. How can people listening, that are inspired by you, help support you and your impact?
Oh, that's so kind. I would say, if anything I've said lands, take it with you. If it didn't, leave it behind. If you're interested in following along, most of my stuff I post on LinkedIn, and sometimes it's related to investing in peace building and conflict resolution, and sometimes it's just life. And welcome them to take a look. And I welcome the feedback. If people have stuff they like, let me know. If people have things they didn't like or think could be better, I welcome that. I grow from that.
Awesome. Well, Brian, thank you so much for the time. I've really enjoyed it and look forward to talking again soon.
Yeah, it was such a pleasure. It's great to do it on a screen. Again, I think the world of you. I love our conversations. I'm flattered and honored to be a guest, and I'll be excited to see you at an upcoming premiere.
Thanks for checking out this episode of People Are the Answer. For more information, go to peoplearetheanswer.com. Please like, subscribe, rate, whatever you can do on various platforms. We really appreciate the support. And if you're interested, check out my other podcast, The Late Game Podcast. You can learn more at thelategame.com. Thanks.